be very important in the future, attended. Basically it entails this idea that with the use of culture and language, there can be some abstraction made regarding the structures underlying a lot of social processes, and as well as political and psychic. So basically Lacan starts his career after getting kicked out of this international organization by creating, by completely kind of moving in the direction of boiling the whole psychoanalytic theory down to 4 fundamental concepts. And why does he need to do this? Well, his idea about why it needs to be done is that he looks at the Anglo-Saxon Jewish immigrant also into Anglo-Saxon countries establishment that's running psychoanalysis at the time, and he sees that also a lot of things are lost in translation. So a lot of things get politically translated, and that is used then to pervert Freud's theory. So he basically says that in order for there to be any kind of fundamental debate about the future of this impossible profession, we need to agree that we're talking about the same things. And this is where he comes up with the concepts of repetition, transference, unconscious, and the drive. But we're not going to be talking about them directly today, as far as basically he then farther moves on to make his theory even more structuralist anyway, and base it even more on language, because structuralism is the idea of language being a material thing. The materiality of language has been, has a long history, but it allows at the same time to develop totalizing structural modeling of basically anything that involves language. However, one thing that Lacan adds to this whole structuralist cosmology that develops in '60s and involves people like Althusser, Foucault, Badiou, Miller, Jacques Miller, and groups like Cahiers, the Leninist Marxist, and then Cahiers, the Analyst, which were groups that were producing these Cahiers magazines in Paris in '60s, and they were heavily developing structuralist concepts in relation to politics. And so this is kind of a background of some of the people that he is surrounded by, and by the time he presents the seminar that Michael mentioned after 1968, he is offering us 4 themes that he's going to build the whole 4 discourses based on. And this is S1, S2, hard subject, and object. So the idea of linguistic, it's called alienation in psychostructuralism, is that, and you can also see on your handouts, that in a way, subject before the language, not even being a subject, enters, world in some kind of whatever holistic, animalistic form that is not necessarily itself consisting of any linguistic qualities. So then, in a way, language in Lacan's theory is perceived as a sort of a intrusion that enters into the organism. And if this is Venn diagrams that Lacan actually himself did not use to illustrate his seminars, but Jacques-Alain Miller used, and I think that they're somehow useful because in a kind of two-dimensional way they show how entry of language into the being of organism creates this kind of a cut. And as a result of this linguistic cut, we get subject. Subject is divided onto basically things that language can symbolize and things that are beyond its capacity. So language itself, big other, has, big other is, for Lacan, the totality of language. This big other is basically the totality of language. And S1 is master signifier. Basically, in structuralist theory, language is itself divided, and that's the kind of this emptiness in the language that I'm going to talk about. It is divided on basically form and meaning. It is divided on unifying shape that the speech produces, and meaning that it's trying to communicate. So S2 and S1 are basically barred from each other, and this bar is exactly where we have the creation of the subject. So the subject is created as a result, but one important thing that differentiates Lacan's structuralism from one of Saussure and Lévi-Strauss is that in dialectic 2, this lack produced, this barred subject produced by alienation, by entry of a child into the world in which it has to engage through linguistic and cultural means and symbolic means, that as a result of this division, we get some part of the subject that is not symbolizable and that is, in a way, correspondent to what was kind of cut off from subject by the language. So, in a way, the whole child, before it internalizes language and becomes alienated towards itself through language and starts only thinking of itself through language, its past self that it perceives as something that it was before alienation is perceived as this object, that kind of pure life fantasy, right? So Lacan is using this object methane as a material proof of that excess that is produced in subdivision of the subject. So then Lacan uses some other structural relationships between these four concepts that he was earlier developing, actually through 50s and 60s, and they have to do with logical square. Logical square is a totalizing model of logical positioning of things in certain sets in the world. You know, that we can have a set where there is universal affirmation, where every member of the set is member of the set. We can have a set where some members are not part of it and others are, and we can have a set that nobody's member of, or only some members are not members of. But I'm not going to go in detail in this logical square. I'm just going to show how this logic works in the case of social link that he's really basing these four discourses on in 1969. So social link is basically agent, and that's in all theories of social link, that is producing a speech act towards other, and this speech act in itself produces some product of the speech. So in order there to be a social link, in order there to be some kind of power relationship, and actually not only in between subjects, and you can see it on your handout, but also within subject, because we can see how if this is big other is equal to the unconscious. And if this is master signifier in psychoanalytic theory, it's equal to the ego. And if you look at your lower left corner of the handout, you can see these psychoanalytic relations.
Oh, it's okay.
You can see psychoanalytic relations between these four. S is subject. The small. This is S1. This is the S1 is here. Small object. Sorry. Yeah. Object I is here. S1 is basically kind of covering up. Master signifier is ego. It's kind of a completing signification that covers up over this leg in symbolic. And in this way, it's a kind of illusion or constant misrecognition of unity of subject, when in reality subject is consistent of multiple symbolic drives that in reality do not make one whole as perfectly as we would like to think of ourselves as subjects. So this has also intrasubjective component, but in 1969 he takes it to the political level and says that same logic is working when we talk about subject on political level. That, for example, in master-slave dialectic that comes from Hegel in this case, agent is S1. This monarch or sort of a supreme producer of power that stands above other citizens of the state, and it produces object A. Object A is surplus, right? Surplus jouissance, surplus enjoyment. So surplus enjoyment is that exact surplus that produced by this symbolic operation of splitting between S1 and S2. And you need that splitting in any speech act, because in any speech act you're going to have somebody producing this speech act and somebody receiving it. So you have to have other as symbolic representation of the subject, and you have to have the actor. What Lacan adds to this to this social link theory is the division, that half of the discourse is taking place in the unconscious, and effectively the product of the discourse of language is produced out of direct control of the conscious level of agent and other. Something is produced that cannot be directly also accessed by any of the two. And the reason for that is that the agent of speech itself is divided as well, because as far as speech is, it's impossible to fully communicate the speech. So on one hand, we see kind of guys creating very boiled down, minimalist concepts of how to talk about everything, but at the same time, he's saying that actually any speech act, any kind of transfer of speech or information is in itself always a failure, because always there is going to be something that is not going to be communicated in speech, and that something he calls the truth of the discourse that is not omitted from the speech because of the limitations of the speech itself. So basically, nothing is more divided than here, product of the discourse and truth, because we can see how for truth to produce something in social power relationship for this position, it has to first influence the agent, and then it's going to, from which it is foreclosed itself, that will in itself then communicate something that's impossible to fully communicate. It's impossible, Lacan says, to fully speak the truth. We always speak only half of it. And then, in itself, the other is producing something that it itself is foreclosed from. So this is, with these maxims here, in this monarchic kind of fundamental state of discourse, and as well as this is kind of a structure of our psyche, because we have ego relating to the unconscious, in a way producing the jouissance, which is surplus enjoyment, and the truth behind the ego that it's trying to cover up. It's the division of the subject that I'm showing here, that the subject is created by this split, by alienating through the language, because it only can think of itself, subject, as I, as one, some kind of misrecognition of multiplicity that we are, that language divides us into as one. And we relate to this multiplicity, and we command it in our minds. But the truth is that, this discourse is hiding the barred subject, right? It's hiding the fact that it's divided, and of course, a king is hiding that he's naked, so to say. So whoever is presenting that illusion of unity is in itself hiding the lack of coherent, symbolic, all-encompassing structure. And this is exposed when we see social movements, for example, that expose the lack, the shortcomings of the power, and confront master with demands for recognition of things that are missing in the power relations. If you guys can see on the board, it's the discourse that's on the right of the hysteric, of the master. And again, the thing is that what this demand for the master to be better, in a way, produces is nothing else but more of the same symbolic structure. This also, S2, is what Lacan refers to as savoir, knowledge. It's knowledge because Lacan says that the unconscious is structured like language, and we can see that our body is basically completely influenced by language, and our body itself is presented to us through the language. So in a way, this multiplicity of, for example, slaves, this is, he takes this from master-slave relationship from Hegel. S1 is master, S2 is slave. And Lacan says that slave has the knowledge how to, or supposed knowledge how to satisfy the master. And of course it fails, of course this knowledge is incomplete, but it produces the surplus enjoyment that on a political scale, and Lacan calls Seminar 17 the other side of psychoanalysis, because he's saying that on the other side it is political, it can be, might as well be political, and he's drawing a homology, a comparative materialist comparison between political system and psychoanalytic system of thought, theory, to show how in case of master discourse, this is called master discourse, object A, surplus enjoyment, is also same as on the political scale is surplus value. So it is what effectively the slaves produce as a product of their labor, and there he draws homology between Freud and Marx by comparing, by talking about universal qualities of material qualities of excess produced by language. So this excess in case of kind of movement is not in the place of actor, Lacan says, but it is also repressed itself. Why is it repressed? Because the movements cannot really act from their point of desire. They're in constant resistance to the master discourse, to the master signifier, and they are antagonistic to it within its rules, in a way. So in hysteric discourse, we still get symbolic being in charge of everything, because in a way, hysteric is telling master, you know, I don't like how you're how you're governing. I, you know, see that you're lacking some things in yourself, and then basically this knowledge or symbolic structure is filling that lack for the hysteric, and we get a discourse right over there, the discourse of university. So discourse of university is this knowledge of kind of hysteric processes in the society, kind of antagonisms and confrontations with power that we are seeing more and more since the Enlightenment. And so this is a discourse of bourgeoisie, but he calls it university discourse, the discourse of multitude that supposedly has no masters and no kings and no citizens that are above other citizens, symbolically speaking, and have more value. The life of the human is supposedly equal across the board, and it's treating the other, the human, as this life form that it knows best what it's good for. In university, for example, it's the university and the student. So student is perceived as this kind of tabula rasa, blank slate, that university knows best what's good for. So it's an objectivist and empiricist discourse that claims that it can objectively study the other and define what's the best for it. But of course it's divided as any other social link, and it's in reality producing nothing than a part subject, because why? Again, it's the big other, the multiplicity of language that is completely symbolic, when in itself it has division between itself as multiple and itself as one, because it can never incorporate into that one all of its multiplicity. And here we see that in the truth position of university discourse, or the discourse of the bourgeoisie, we have master signifier, we have a certain ideology, we have something that stands above this claim for equality and objectivity, and this is basically a new form of capitalist rule where the supremacy of capitalist ideology is not directly presented, but mediated by supposed welfare state, good for all. And if somebody has issues with welfare state, they will just confront whatever they think is the problematic power structure in the government, and will produce actually themselves as just more bourgeoisie. So this hysteric discourse is kind of a discourse of how do people enter into bourgeoisie, and here we have already full-on bourgeois discourse that, after especially postmodernism, is the dominant one. Why we say postmodernism? Because postmodernism does away with the subject. It says that the division itself is not so clear-cut, and that there is no fundamental antagonism to this division and alienation. So it does not recognize subject as such. Subject is itself a complete illusion for postmodernism, and that's why the subject and S2 are complete opposite spectrums of this square, right? It's a kind of a logical square that is turning, if you see from master to hysteric to university, quarter turn. And so last discourse is discourse of the analyst, which is when the central antagonism of all this division is placed in the place of actor. So the responsibility is taken exactly for that is beyond the language, and the language is split. This division between S2 and S1 is completely, because these truth and product of the discourse are the most separated from each other, because they have, the discourse has to go this completely impossible circle to complete itself, and it's never a completed circle, despite the fact that this, for example, claims that it is. So in this case, the antagonism between the one and multiple is completely opened up, and the dialectic between excess and lack of signification, as simple as a substitution is a lack of something signified, and it's perceived as lack of meaning, perceived as lack of pleasure principle. If we go back to Freud, so basically this is limit of pleasure principle. It's a pleasure principle is the idea that language can kind of circle and offer us everything in kind of ready-made symbolic structure. And here it's completely antagonized, but at the same time we see that in a position of truth in this analyst discourse is knowledge. It's theory. It's a different theory. It's a theory that radically is split from it being complete as and one. It's an open knowledge, as Lacan relates it to knowledge of the university, which is kind of absolutist knowledge of we know everything, we can decide everything best. So this knowledge is radically split by exactly analysts antagonizing the relation between this something that's left out with what is the whole in the symbolic edifice itself, and this antagonization of something beyond language is done through analytic act. Analytic act is the idea that, again, you recognize that in a speech act, you're going to do something that's going to be based on your desire, but it's never going to reach fully the other's position, and is always going to be ending up hitting some kind of void of lack or problem with it. So this discourse, in a way, is the one that recognizes the structure of the social link or power relation itself, and is acting subjectivating itself, basically identifying itself with that position of impossible action. And it produces, again, some kind of truth that's self-identical to itself, and that's why it is S1. It is a sort of a new hierarchy of power that inevitably any action produces, but within itself it is at the same time problematizing this relation to the power that it produces. So if it's a revolutionary discourse, it problematizes the power relationship with the new order, whereas, for example, a university discourse is completely self-confident. So these are kind of four discourses, and we're going to answer some more questions on this later, but I just feel like this is a lot of information as always, and
maybe you could put the four discourses on the board.
Right.
Since it's the production of the four discourses.
Right.
Engaging here for S1 and S2.
Right. So basically, we have here. And this is hysteric. And discourses can transform in kind of flip in both directions. In a way, there is these two are actually opposed to each other in a way. But and so are these two. So I guess there is there is no nice circular motion through them. They are in itself in antagonism with one another, and we're going to hear more on some of these problems as we go to our next presenters. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. So Fred, can you take us to the capitalist discourse and its relationship to where we are today, to the analytical discourse?
Right.
Yeah.
So yeah, I'm gonna talk to you right now on a sort of a fifth discourse. It's true that normally we know that there is only 4 discourses that I just explained to you. But the later Lacan is slowly moving away from structuralism to sort of like acknowledge what is the situation of the world and of post-capitalism and of Western society, where sort of what is grounding the whole schema, which is the master signifier, and something that can ground a system of logic is starting to crumble and dissipate. So we have to sort of reevaluate the situation and see in which way we can talk about a revolutionary discourse and how it is opposed to a capitalist discourse, and how this capitalist discourse, as I will try to show you, can be taken at some level for an analytic discourse. So I will try to talk to you about the differences in between master discourse in a way, capitalist discourse, and the potential, the revolutionary potential of analytic discourse. And so to start, I'm going to refer to Lacan, who gave a speech in Milan in 1978 called La Salamandre, in which he discussed the differences between the master discourse, the analytic discourse, and the capitalist discourse. And in the course of his reasoning, Lacan underlined the fact that contrary to what we might be tempted to think, the classical revolutionary discourse for Lacan should be placed alongside of the master discourse for him. So I quote him because I thought for here the left for him it was a sort of teasing, first good quote coming from Lacan. He said, "Naturally, we must not deceive ourselves. Making a revolution that signifies returning to the point of departure." And in a way, you see, I mean, on the things, you make 1/4 of a turn, and each discourse generates the other up until they're back on the first one.
The product is S1 if we look at the discourse. It produces exactly that.
Yeah. So you keep switching, turning each discourse, and then you go back to the master discourse, and you have a full revolution in a sort of classical astrological term, full revolution. And he says this is even demonstrated historically that there is no nastier master discourse than at the place where one makes a revolution. And you can think about French Revolution, it ended up in a lot of blood. So, and then Lacan adds, you would like to go for it differently. Obviously, it could go better. What would be needed would be for the master discourse to be a little less primary, and to say it all, not so fucking stupid. That's Lacan's word. And in fact, if you looked at my little turning formula there, you must see how I structure this analytic discourse. It is the exact opposite of the master discourse. That is, at the level of the master discourse, what I have just called the master signifier, S1, it is this that I am occupied with at the moment. And so for him, what is at stake for our society in Western culture, what is the master signifier? He says is, there is such thing as one. We all believe that we're one, that we deserve what we need for ourselves, that we're all fragmented, separated, and we need everything for ourselves as one. So the signifier is what introduced the one and the illusion of being one and isolated from others into the world. And it suffices that there be something of the one for the four discourses to begin and to commend to S2. Which S2, again, it's true, it's the other, but it's also mainly what's going to give meaning, what's going to interpret the utterance of speech. So eventually that's what's going to give meaning. Okay. So, end of quote. So contrary to what we think, the revolutionary discourse, according to Lacan, is not different from the master discourse. And worse even, okay, as we see, historically speaking, perhaps the nastiest discourse. So this is why, in a way, for Lacan, there is no such thing as a revolutionary discourse. In the four discourses, it's not present. And why is this revolutionary discourse for Lacan equal the master discourse? It's because generally it's going to ignore the truth from which it is speaking of. So meaning that it's going to be fully empowered to impose its truth while not knowing exactly what is feeding this discourse of revolution. While on the flip side, if you see on the analytic discourse, what comes to the fore is precisely this object A, which is what is feeding discourse. So all of a sudden, in a master discourse, the object A is veiled. In the analytic discourse, it's what is being unveiled. Okay. So I'm going to try in the following presentation to focus on how can we think a revolutionary discourse that could be mapped onto an analytic discourse, and as such can be a revolutionary discourse that won't be so stupid, as Lacan said, that won't end up following the same pattern as the master discourse. So how can we find a revolutionary discourse that would have the same kind of enlightenment as the analytic discourse? So first, I'm going to come back to the notion of this capitalist discourse, because why is it important for Lacan? And for that, in order for me to explain to you what is the capitalist discourse, I'm going to use a text from Jacques called The Duty and the Drive, where he commented on Lacan's mentioning the capitalist discourse in Television. That was the text where Lacan talked for the first time about the capitalist discourse. And in this, Jacques is going to show that the capitalist discourse is the re-articulation of the discourse of science, which could be the discourse of university, and the discourse of the master. It's a new coming together of the discourse of the master and the discourse of university, which gives this definition to the capitalist discourse. So why? Well, for Jacques Alain, it's very...
You're going to draw the...
We'll see, we'll come to it later. So what is very important to think is that nature during the 19th and 20th century was the name of the real. What does that mean? It means that the real was able to be organized, submitted to certain laws of logic and mathematics, meaning that like in classical science, you can sort of look for rules and logic that will be able to foresee what a phenomenon is going to produce in the world, and there's always a certain patterns that you can discover, and then you can put a mathematical formula to be like, this is how it works. And in this idea, nature provides you what we could call the other of the other, which means a meta-discourse that be like, oh, mathematics, they are mapping something real outside of the world, because look, all the world is following those patterns and those phenomena. But he said that during the late 19th century and throughout the 20th century, what happened is that this very concept of nature and the concept of science that was working with it hand in hand started to crumble. Okay? And actually, if you want, in the New Lacanian Ing, there's an article called "The Real is Without Law" that explained this movement where the real as nature start to crumble and science no longer can pretend to tell the truth about this real of nature. And you can think of, it's true also, it's mapped on Hegel, when Hegel was saying at first, all is rational is real, and all is real is rational. You have a coming together of this rationality, logic, the real nature. Everything was forming a sort of stable world. But of course, this is what is at stake today, because nature starts to, and science starts to acknowledge that all the laws that it produces are but a construction, relevant to a certain extent, but we don't have cross like theories of quantum. I'm not going to go there, but it's not unified any longer, and the very concept of nature is disappearing. So in front of this loss, he says, Jacques says, well, there is two attitudes on the rise. Because the problem is with the loss of the concept of nature, what we've also acknowledged is a sort of a crumbling of the social structures that were mapped onto this vision of nature. So which means that the same thing applies to the Oedipus complex at the social level, which means that when you study science, you can organize the world according to law, and when you study human societies, you can organize it according to the law of the father and the Oedipus complex, and all has its law and themes and things like that. But the problem is that the moment you start to see the concept of nature crumbling, you're going to see the concept of the name of the father as the master signifier crumbling too. So this is why he says there's two sort of attitudes nowadays towards this loss and this dissemination or like crumbling of the master signifiers in science and in social science. He says the first one could be seen as a reaction to this collapse, of course, of the idea of nature, and a desperate attempt to rebuild what has been destroyed. And this is the return, of course, of the religion and the religious discourse nowadays. And Lacan talked about, he gave a conferences on the future of religious discourse, and he was like, you will see, guys, the more we're going to destroy all the values, the more people are going to need to go back, certain people are going to need to go back to very 101. Here is your name of the Father, here is who you are, here's what you have to do. So we're going to witness very strong coming back of the religious discourse as a reaction to the situation of complete disorientation. And that could even rise to a form of extremism, and suicide bombers, etc. And on the flip side, of course, at the university, what do we see? We see a celebration of this loss. And we see in the university, you know, the rise of gender theory, queer theory, post-colonial theory, deconstruction, postmodernism, all that we've been describing, which is like rejoicing in front of the collapse of all the master signifier, and keep deconstructing, keep disorienting everything, and keep saying that there is no center, there's nothing to be organized around a solid value. As
no central antagonism.
No central antagonism. It's just a pure crumbling. Okay, well, but then that's where we see here that there's a sort of like that's where we're going to come to this object A. What does that mean, this whole situation? Because what is problematic, and we can already see that in Deleuze and Guattari, the anti-Oedipus, it's that on the one hand we feel that it's revolutionary to attack all this master signifier and to show that there is construction, that there is no such thing as a natural hierarchy in between races, natural hierarchy in between men and women, etc. We feel that it's revolutionary. But on the flip side, and again, Deleuze and Guattari already pointed at it in the anti-Oedipus, and they say, well, but it also goes very well with capitalism. And capitalism loved that too. Deconstruct all the values. And even Marx, in his manifesto, pointed at it. And I'm going to quote Marx here. He said, bourgeoisie cannot exist without constantly revolutionizing its instruments of production, which means the relations of production, so the social bounds. That is to say, all the social links. And this constant shaking of the social system, every social bond fixed and covered with rust, with all the venerable and antique ideas attached to it, everything that was solid and permanent is disappearing. Everything that was sacred is being profanated. All right. So now, in front of this situation, we can ask, so if the sort of main task of the revolutionary discourse that was to debunk the discourse of the master is sort of now the discourse of the master in place, capitalism. What should we do? And on top, when we start to acknowledge the fact, that's where I'm going to try to go, that psychoanalysis has been working very hard to achieve this state too, and this goal, that in a way has been feeding this movement of post-capitalism at a very full speed. Why? And so that's, we're going to see now, and come back to your question of the pleasure principle and the notion of knowledge. Because psychoanalysis has displaced the generally admitted definition of knowledge. It debases conscious knowledge and elevates unconscious knowledge. And through the debasement of conscious knowledge, it also debases the pretension of conscious knowledge to form a system or close totality, we're mentioning. So the problem with such a debasement is that it goes against what politics needs in order to function. Why? Because for politics to function, it implies a certain sense of community, a certain sense of belonging, and a certain sense of identity. And this idea of closure of itself, because the idea of a totality or a community is related to the idea of a possible satisfaction. Meaning, if you want to be satisfied, you need to know who you are, who do you belong to, and what you want. What can satisfy you, and to know that, you need to know who you are, and what is your group of belonging. So that's very interesting when you see that there is like a very deep link in between the possibility of satisfaction, the voicing of discontent, and the way you're going to frame your knowledge about who you are. So that's where we see that the link between conscious knowledge and satisfaction is, for psychoanalysis, the main obstacle to reach a beyond of the sort of like functioning of the capitalist state. Meaning that in order to voice a regular revolutionary discourse, you're gonna have to remain on a conscious level to be like, this is what I need, this is what I want, this is what gives me pleasure. But on the flip side, if you do that, then you repress the unconscious knowledge and the possibility of digging out beyond a certain form of pleasure, which eventually, as you'll see, might be the limit of the capitalist discourse. And when the capitalist discourse goes towards the analytic discourse. Let me try to explain you that. Okay. So the junction or the articulation between knowledge and then what Lacan called the jouissance of the other. What does that mean? Again, so because, as Vakhtang explained, because we're speaking beings, okay, not animals, we cannot relate to survive or to know what we need to be satisfied onto our instinct. It's no longer possible since the moment we started to speak and to compromise ourselves with language and all the rules of society. So contrary to other animals which have an instinctual knowledge about what do they have to do in order to persevere in their own being and to reproduce, etc., the speaking being that we are, because we speak, have disrupted this natural knowledge and are now forced to invent a new knowledge, a conscious one sometimes, in order to know how to live again. And object A that he described in this configuration, I could say, would be what marks the place of instinct or the drive. Where was the drive in an animal is object A in someone that speaks. What does that mean? That means that the object A marks an empty place that has been hollowed out by language itself in the place of instinct or the drive. This is why Lacan can also say that object A, as the emptied place of the instinctual life, is also what connects all the speaking being to a possibility of plus de jouir, more enjoyment. Why more enjoyment? Because the second you plug your way to get pleasure to speech, the more you can go beyond the instinctual satisfaction that you need. And the minute you go there, you enter the realm of the death drive in a way, because what normally prevents life to stop at the right moment for a healthy thing is instinct. And then language, or you voicing your needs, you can go all the way to death. And that's why the capitalist discourse will feed onto that, and the consumption of more objects, more. The infinite, the idea of infinite, of a constant more, is not given in nature. It's the plugging of nature and language that enhance this movement of more. All right. Okay. So now we have to understand. So what is the role played by object A in the capitalist discourse today? And for this, I'm going to rely on another text from Jacques Gomelauri, which is called A Fantasy. So Jacques Gomelauri says, okay, we're witnessing a complete disorientation of the subject, a crumbling of all the master signifiers, but then does that mean that we are left with no possible discourse to voice a form of revolutionary discourse or a form of discontent? And first Miller says, well, we might have no longer any master signifier, but what became the new star of our system is this object A. And he says, the object A occupies in each the new prominent position in our post-capitalist and capitalist society. And Miller writes, I quote him, our hypothesis is that the object A imposes itself on the disoriented subject, inviting him to go beyond his inhibition. And I cannot dig too much into that, but and you will see, so he's like, okay, what is here always all the time, it's this object A, this surplus jouissance, that is more, okay, and it's going to produce subjects that is divided, but then what is sort of tricky is that this divided subject is going to be used to be like, okay, you don't know here what it is that convicts you whole. Well, we're not going to tell you exactly, but we're going to keep providing you with little things that you're going to fill your void here as infinity, more and more. So that's where the market goes crazy, and why marketing can use psychoanalysis to sort of tease your little lack and to sell you more things. And so this is the situation here. And then he says, well, what is interesting is that, okay, society is like, it's fine, you can just feed your will to plus de jouir, it's good, more enjoyment for you. But then what is going to come here as the sort of new master discourse would be all the instances where we're checked if we are staying in the right place for more enjoyment. You can enjoy more and consume more, but up to this point. Otherwise, you're becoming a criminal, you're becoming a deviant, or you're becoming marginalized, or you're becoming this and that, and this and that, and this and that. Okay, so that's when all these limits are here. And generally, so now the limits are never given in the name of nature, because nature has disappeared, as I told you. It's never given in the name of a master signifier that would be like, oh, this is perversion, this is not perversion, or this kind of people, no, they're no good. No. They're gonna just use, Jacques Gomelauri says, the principle of utility and sort of the idea of maximization. So they would be like, no, you're deviant not because you want this kind of thing, it's because you are not a proper good consumer that maximizing all your resources, or you could have done this, that would have been more efficient. So the idea of efficiency, goal-oriented, utility is the sort of like the framing of this new master discourse that is just there to guide you towards enjoyment in a happy capitalist society that doesn't boil too much up to the point of revolution. Okay, and so I'm just going to finish, and I'm almost done. So then the idea, and I wanted to title my the presentation "A Portrait of the Analyst as a Saint," because in a way, the analyst is, so, and you have here this sort of knowledge of the whole situation that is produced. So that would be the capitalist discourse. As you see, that looks exactly like the analytic discourse here. But again, just the reverse.
This would be capitalist discourse?
That would be the capitalist discourse. They are the same. But in a way, in the capitalist discourse, the object A speaks. Well, in the analytic, I mean, you did an arrow, but the analyst remains silent. It doesn't speak, and it tries to have him to voice.
Well, we don't really want to overlay.
Let him finish.
But I just finished my
We'll do the improv too.
Right,
it's fine.
And, but the whole idea is that the differences between the capitalist discourse and the analytic discourse is that in the analytic discourse, first of all, you're going to have to try to slowly become aware of the object A, which is what is producing you to speak, or what is at the core of your desire for more enjoyment, more enjoyment, more enjoyment. So instead of speaking this desire, the analytic discourse is going to try to put it at the fore and unveil it, and unveil the structure of more consumption. And so you at least going to become aware. And I will just finish with one citation of Lacan, who describes the role of the analyst, and he compares the role of the analyst to the role of a saint. And a saint, he says, is not someone that gives you charity, but that acts as a trash. So I quote Lacan. It's also in television. He says, a saint's business, to put it clearly, is not caritas. Caritas is charity. Rather, he acts as trash. His business being trashitas, meaning like to help you to stop being charitable, to stop trying to think that you're good, that you're performing, that you're like maximizing everything, just to go towards failure. So as to embody what the structure, so the analysts play the trash, so as to embody what the structure entails, namely allowing the subject of the unconscious, to take him as the cause of his own desire. In fact, it is through the objection of discourse, dont a objet a little a, through the objection of discourse, that the subject in question has a chance to be aware of his position, at least within the structure. For the saints, this is not amusing. But I imagine that for a few years, glued to this TV, it converges with many of the oddities of the acts of saints. That is, produces an effect of jouissance who doesn't get the meaning along with the pleasure. The saint alone stays mum. Fat chance of getting anything out of him. That is really the most amazing thing in the whole business. Amazing for those who approach it without illusion. The saint is the refuse of jouissance.
Thank you.
The author of that paper you're dealing with?
Lacan's son-in-law,
Right.
Jacques Gomelauri. Married Lacan's daughter, Judith.
And, good.
Okay.
So you're going to examine and explore trends and
I'm gonna explore a few
psychoanalysis?
trends and-
Yeah, no, I mean, first, yeah.
I'm going to make a few comments about this last presentation.
Okay.
I think it's important before we rush into describing what Lacan meant with the capitalist discourse that we have to be very certain in a sense about what we're talking about with the four discourses per se, since he specifically in the very same lecture is very careful to announce that there are only four discourses. That is to say, the capitalist discourse, as he describes it, is a fake discourse, or depending upon what interpreters you have out there right now, it's certainly being hotly debated. Is it a para-discourse or a sub-discourse? And conceptually, that's an important thing to recognize. That is to say, the four discourses are still the legitimate discourses upon which every single social relation is in fact happening. That is to say, social links, in the sense that an agent begins something, the other is responding, which is both a dialectic and a partnership in that action of the discourse has been laid out, whether it's the master discourse, the stare at university, or the analyst. So the subject, so to speak, to the other is nonetheless involved in a relational activity, movement of a discourse, which has both dialectics and a partnership at the level of the impossible at the top there. So I want to pause for a moment in terms of getting too carried away with assuming that Calvin's discourse has arisen as a kind of totalist story, since we certainly see in Lacan himself a resistance to that very concept when he insists that there are only engaging and vice versa as the movement of the discourse develops. Without going too much into the Calvin's discourse, it seems to at the very least be something of a problem right there because no proper symbolic is set up between self and other, so to speak. So I'm not going to get too much more into that right now. I'm going to actually dive a little bit into some of the depths of what, to go in a way back to what Vakhtang has outlined, and to give it a little depth in a different direction to some degree, that is to say, to get a little bit into the level of the barred subject per se, and what we mean by structuralism at a very sort of rock bottom level. So just to touch on structuralism just quickly in case people are not familiar, the big innovation in it is that we're talking about syncodocal relationships. So it's not just simply linear in time, but it's how power relations are working despite time. So whatever is happening in terms of time, we're looking at how there are interrelationships structurally, so to speak. That's where the term comes from. So, okay, let me begin here. I'm going to focus on the impossible in both the hysteric and analyst discourse primarily, and we're really speaking of alienation and misrecognition when we're discussing the impossible. The key premise in all of this theory is that the four discourses coexist in a sense. We don't see necessarily only one operating at any given time, but rather at any given moment sometimes a mix, but we can quite often nonetheless, which is an interesting aspect of it, see a strong weight or coloring of just one. And nonetheless, the whole action of the agent to other to product line is a consistent movement throughout all of the discourse. It's very important. It's not that they suddenly necessarily break into a strange mix. It's quite, I won't say determined, but it moves in a very strong way, hysterically, let's say. So this begins at problems that relate to another set, and the theory gives us a certain kind of power to cut through this noise to what we might call a thought, which is perhaps really the most radical thing we have from an analytic position. And Lacan, in this very same lecture that Fred is referring to, said something that he said, the word being has no meaning outside of language, which is sort of important, and I'm sorry to say, but it subverts this concept of nature as properly understood in psychoanalysis. As to say, we are always within language. Nature, so to speak, is immanent to our very effort to symbolize it within the human to other relationship. We're always in a dialectic with the process and problem of language that can never say at all. So when he says the word being has no meaning outside of language, being a loaded word in metaphysics, we don't know, having to do with ontology, it's a pretty important concept. The word being has no meaning outside of language. It means that when we do have a sense of, quote, being, we're really in a realm of thought that is anti-philosophical. We are dealing with the subject as a cut subject that has gone through what we would call the Oedipal complex, as to say, we've learned to not put our pants, we've learned to not suckle on the breast, et cetera, and that's through this whole process, and finally with language, we have scars. There's a cut, there's symptoms. Nobody comes out of it in any kind of cookie cutter way. There's no robots. So, that is to say, we are caught in a problem of signifying. As Lacan at another point remarks, man, in a sense, is thinking with his objects. So let me just quote another thing from television that goes to this further. Man thinks as a consequence of the fact that a structure, that of language, implies it. A structure carves up his body, a structure that has nothing to do with anatomy. The shearing happens to the soul. So witness the hysteric. Through the obsessional symptom, a thought that burdens the soul, that doesn't know what to do with it. The subject doesn't know what to do with this thought that arises like a symptom. This means that thought is not something that we would think of in philosophical sense. Thought is in disharmony with the soul or with our subjectivity, in fact. So what we're talking about, in a certain sense, is a dynamic that, in a sense, again, is dialectical. And this does go back to Hegel. That is to say, there is labor and work in it, and Marx. So I'm going to refer now to Tome 6. Tome 6, he wrote a recent book called Countless Unconscious, where he's drawing out the homology between Marxism and Lacan's theoretical work here. And he makes a good point, and I'm just going to refer to this one point. He makes an argument that Freud, as early as their interpretation of dreams, discovers that something quite different than what the ancients or 19th century theories had thought about dream states. That is to say that it's not simply a kind of a glossary of reference points that we can just map. There's an actual work going on in any dreamer, that what Freud called displacement and condensation. So that means that, as some kind of thought we've had through the day, it arrives in a dream, an intense thing with your father talking to you, who knows, whatever it may be. There's actually a process of work that's going on at the level of unconscious. It's sort of a very simple level. We're actually producing a kind of labor that it may not be a good labor, that is to say, in the end, it may not be, unfortunately, because of, again, language, we are not necessarily producing the good thought in the end of the process, but we are coming up in the dream with a kind of condensed or displaced version of what we'd like to think about something. And it's through the analytic mode, unfortunately, or fortunately as it may be, that there is some chance of starting to break it down, some chance of starting to actually read it and decode it. And this goes to what Michael was mentioning earlier about really what the four discourses really help us to do is how reading and interpretation can be a political practice, and how we can actually begin to theorize, which again relates to possibility and problem of thought. Where and when and where can we actually reach a thought, so to speak, that will give us radical agency. So this labor activity that is, in a sense, at the very root of our subjecthood, our subjectivity as being cut to the subjects, operates dialectically. And it may not always, in itself, reach a satisfactory conclusion because of the various operations of misrecognition that go on in any social link. So what's interesting about, to go back to the master sisters, to make it very simple, one thing that people don't quite always get is that, which one is that whenever we have this impossibility from agent, again, it doesn't have to be somebody to you. It could be you in relation to, but meaning agent means just starting the discourse up, wherever it starts from. So at the very point that the discourse begins, we have a certain break because language can't say it all. So the other has to interpret what this could possibly mean. One of the interesting things that happens here is actually a proliferation of responses. Because we can't actually read the person's mind or whatever the desire is, the true demand, so to speak. So let's say I'm a master, I'm with some friends, and I say, I'm hungry. It immediately sets up a demand, and they then go, and we end up looking for all kinds of food. It may not be, in fact, what I was even thinking about, but we produce a whole bunch of different options of food. So now, when we talk about university discourse, we're talking about, what he means by that is really knowledge producing itself, just for its own sake. And he's differentiating that from the spirit of the concept of science, which is to say that there are only so many innovative truths that occur in historical time. So there's theory of relativity, there's analysis, there's Darwin, there's various different movements that break open a new understanding. After that, there's variations, but they're not really going beyond the knowledge that's really being regurgitated, re-evaluated, re-modified. It doesn't bring us into a new direction itself. So I want to talk a little bit now about some recent sort of current, shall we say, trends or thoughts in modern society that we can map, in a sense, with the four discourses to sort of see what's going on with that. And I'm going to give you an example of a very common way of thinking about computer today? Computer is often thought of by many people as a kind of new map, a new analogy of humanity, of that the computer is basically the same in a certain sense as human beings. So I'm going to use this quote. Okay, computers, just like infants, have elaborate methods to distinguish signal to noise. The statistical methods employed in machine learning very heavily mirror our, quote, natural learning, and often due to the ability to employ large clusters of processing power can often surpass our own intuition. This isn't black magic, it's a statistical cost-benefit analysis. Evolution is a statistical outcome. Pre-trained models are a statistical product. We are information processing machines. So in this discourse, which we would probably characterize as something of a hysteria, there is an effort to naturalize both the computer and ourselves as, in a sense, the same thing. So the way to think about it in a different way from a more analytical point of view would be to say, from what Lacan has taught us, that really the computers have no methods. They're simply operations. They're mathematical sequences. So they do not in any way think for themselves because they do not have these initial cuts. They have no sense of the body. They have no sense of language in its relation to the body, which is a very important thing. And as such, a computer does not experience surprise or trauma or pain or the possibility of radical thought. What we have in a computer is an effort to mirror our desire to master certain things. They are machines which can perform operations, increasingly sophisticated tasks, and they represent a certain dream of the subject to be a master, a good master. So again, we have this discourse of the master reoperates itself and how we see a new development that arises. So the computer really, until it possibly has a mortal body that would need to be weaned and trained not to go to the bathroom in its pants, not to, etc., to ultimately learn language in the human sense, would not have a body in the way that we would know it. So it cannot experience tragedy, confusion, comedy. It cannot really think in a certain sense. What we have is really a reproduction of a fantasy of university discourse, that we can have a knowledge production system that would be ultimately some kind of absolute answer to the problem of being a wounded subject. Let me see. In another area, we have, you're probably all familiar with it, of accelerationism. I wanted to draw attention to how that is working today. And I'll just bring up, Peter Wolfendale, who's a philosopher, has talked a bit about what he calls left accelerationism. And I don't know if people are familiar with accelerationism, but it's a certain concept within, depending on how you want to interpret it, a certain wing of influenced by, in some regards, Marxism, depends on how you want to look at it, that imagines essentially that technology and capitalism are in this unified juggernaut that is going so fast that there's no way to control it, that the sort of post-human space has become the story of the day. And it leaves only two different kinds of operations, that for the right-wing accelerationists, they imagine the idea that you have to kind of accept it and develop a new kind of ethics of a sort of post or neo-Confucianism of balance and harmony. And for the left accelerationists, there's an argument that we need to learn how to harness where would be the new best technologies to advance, to become, in a sense, connoisseurs. So I'm going to read from Wolfendale's remarks. If there's any essence of left accelerationism, it is the call to rigorously discriminate between the emancipatory potential of social and industrial technologies that have emerged within capitalism from the oppressive potentials that will inevitably be actualized should we fail to stop them. If technosocial acceleration means dystopia, then this is because we let it and we had an option not to. He goes on to say that naive techno-utopians, crypto-libertarians, and budding neo-reactionaries, some of the most interesting and subtle conversations I've had about serious political and social issues have been had with programmers, in no small part because they have no problem about thinking about complex social structures from a design perspective. How do we debug the socius? So what we're looking at is an imagination about society. That is to say, a relationship of S2, a fantasy of what S2 could be. We are in the realm of university discourse, fantasizing about how we can have, ultimately, a good, proper set of master signifiers to go forward with. So in this case, in his argument, what we're looking at is the effort is finally to debug the socius. So, I don't know, how much more time do we have?
About 3 minutes,
About 3 minutes, okay.
yeah. I'd like to open it to questions.
Okay. I think this session's going to be a little bit too long to get into. Yeah, I wanted to then just lastly leave it with a comment on Black Lives Matter. And what we see with Black Lives Matter is it follows the classical route of how political action should start, which is to say from a certain hysterization in opposition to the master discourse. So what happens is that they're immediately saying, crying out, this is wrong, and attempting to organize to bring that forward into society, to become aware of what is wrong in society. And what's, I think, an interesting development, we don't have much time, but is that instead of deciding to back any one particular candidate at this point, which I thought, in my view, was a very good move on their part, they chose to not endorse, which means they bring themselves really in a position of a relationship between analyst discourse and hysteric. They leave themselves open to that rather than being locked into the university discourse that would be electoral politics, the frame as we already know it, by producing their position within analyst discourse and potentially hysteric discourse at any different times. They're giving themselves more access to separate the truth from the repetition of the university discourse. That's my idea.
And then I'll open it up. We have about 25 minutes for questions. Anybody want to start off with some either interventions, clarifications? Yes.
I would just like to maybe hear more about the analogy between the human and computer. They kind of had a comment about that. I wanted to know more about what you're going with it before I made the comment.
Well, it's hard to tell me your comment.
Well, I just noticed that the description between the analogy, especially the critique analogy, kind of follows David Hume's criticism of the cosmological argument. You say that's a giant anthropomorphism, and eventually that kind of like leads to reject any kind of notion of self and bundle theory and all of that. So I'm kind of wondering, also follow the metaphysical conclusions, which is like, we're looking for presence, looking for mastering power. There is none. I'm just kind of curious, like, what your move from there was, or if you're kind of pointing it out inside.
I was trying to illustrate that there's a sort of common ground, should we say, in the contemporary thoughts that is nonetheless involved in a certain dream of a mastery, a very particular dream of a mastery, so that it's still the subject who is cut, imagining the computer as this ultra being, sort of like God. That's what I was trying to
If I can just show, like maybe this will illustrate that in this fantasy of technological, kind of technocratic progress, a new theory that can help us move forward, whether it's accelerationist theory or other kind of historical materialist theories that are state-based, we see that underneath them we have a pretty strong belief in actual oneness of this anthropomorphism or humanism of sorts. That's a kind of a belief system that's guiding these theories, and this is a belief system in certain human nature, and this is exactly what analyst discourse questions by splitting these belief and objective theory, and making theory unconscious, making theory completely barred.
Yes.
Just a brief question. So, Fred and
Andrew.
I'd like to see a conversation between you guys because maybe I missed it, but I read this stuff a long time ago, and just recently took a class where I had to relearn it. It's hard. I think it's difficult. Hopefully, it took you guys a long time to learn it. But there seems to be a slight antagonism I noticed between the post-structuralism that you're talking about, the fifth rest, and you're stating there is only four aspects.
Correct.
So it might be nice to hear that discussion. And also, that script you wrote over there, which was supposed to be a combination between the master discourse and the university discourse, it might be nice to have that explained better. And have you discuss that a little bit.
Well, my questions would be, if we're going to do that, my questions would be that the imagination of the analyst crumbles itself, theoretical framework, if we understand the analyst as compromised by the quote capitalist discourse, that is to say, does not have access to the truth. The analyst is positioned without a doubt, because in fact, the entire theory operates from the analyst's position. Ultimately, we can only even form this theoretical distance to understand things structurally from the analyst's perspective, ultimately. So, one of the other important things to remember about this is that it's not a natural system, so to speak. The four discourses, as laid out, theoretically allow us to move from them. We are not necessarily caught hysterically in master discourse, hysteric discourse, etc. Through the use of this theory, we're able to then move into another position, another dimension. That's what I was describing with sort of Black Lives Matter. Their move into the potential analyst discourse and hysteric discourse is not a trap. It's in some regards power. So the capitalist discourse, from what I understand, is that it, as Lacan had described it, and I'm not sure if it's not describing a new form among society, that is to say, yuppies. I'm not sure if it's actually characterizing capitalism or a certain pattern in society. Because at the same time, he is very much stressing there are only four discourses.
Because, I mean, if I can add to it, in between the formulation of the four discourses in 1968, 1969, and the capitalist discourse in 1978, there has been a huge shift in Lacan's teaching. And what we call the first Lacan, which were all about logicization and putting everything into the themes, and that climaxed, in a way, in the formulation of the four discourses, and then the graphic design, etc., etc. And then, which were summarized by unconscious is structured like a language, and eventually you use linguistic to formalize all this, and on top, mathematics and logic.
But
and then
Milan wasn't 71 when he speaks about capitalist discourse?
71 too, but that's right at the, so the major break of the later Lacan happens in 1970s, 1971, we say, with or worse, encore, and then even more with choice in the symptom.
Well, in Encore, he comes back to four discourses to map symbolic,
Right.
imaginary, and real on that, right?
It's just I finished.
Yeah.
But what is very important is that then, with this shift, you really have like a Lacan going to, he's no longer talking about S1 and S2, but he's going to talk about la langue and the body, the speaking being, and all the concepts are like completely changed. And I think that approaching the question of the capitalist discourse with Lacan and with the later Lacan, it implies also to sort of like operate this shift at all levels.
Would you want to bring in Heidegger at all into the articulation?
Right, absolutely, and because Jacques Millet actually 3 weeks ago in Rio, he says that, well, we can sort of understand the first Lacan, the second Lacan, like the first Heidegger and the second Heidegger, or the first Wittgenstein and the second Wittgenstein. In a way, for example, the first Wittgenstein is all about logic, and he says, well, we can build a vision of the world, and it's totally formalizable inside like a classic logic. And then the second Wittgenstein will say, well, this is all language games, and language games eventually refers to types of life. And so there's no such thing as a master discourse. There is no such thing as the sort of like the over arc of Lacan first theory. Because then there is no such thing as a speech subject, because each one is a singular case of la langue. So meaning that the whole structure that you lay out of the subject is being mapped out onto a body that singularizes it. And with the singularizing of this process, what is at stake, of course, is the disappearance of the master signifier that grounds the logic of the first Lacan around the operation of castration, the name of the father, phallus. That's all that marks the center of the structure, and then all the deviance, all the movement of the fourth discourse around the positioning towards the castration complex. Like, how are you doing according to the S1? Because if we've been only talking about this, like, are you able to express yourself? Who is the master? Can you express yourself to the master? What was left out from the master? So there's always the master, so like this is me, and then what is left off or not. But then once you decenter this, what happens?
It was always decentered. I mean, what you're presenting is this post-structuralist fantasy of Lacan becoming post-structuralist.
Right.
You know, and you know, it's really a fantasy, I think, because I really wanted to show you guys that exactly in '60s, when he's actually moving away from Heidegger as fast as he can into the structuralist anti-humanist camp that is definitely in opposition to Heidegger, and Wittgenstein and Frankfurt School as well as humanists, and very much devoted to historical materialist fantasy, which is nothing else but university discourse. And, in this regard, yeah, he actually moves in '70s into structurally explaining postmodern condition, which is university discourse, and that's why he does not speak of S1 being in a place of actor anymore, and he shows the difference that postmodernism creates, but that nothing to do with him not recognizing the supremacy of S1, which, as we can see, is in a position of truth, even in university discourse, is the actual kind of unifying power of the domination of one class over another that still makes sense.
I think there's a confusion in his comments on the breakdown of the paternal function, and when we're talking about the four discourses, they're not the same thing. Paternal function is not the same as the master discourse. It might appear that way at certain moments, but these four discourses are operating at any given time. They're not just one. It's a kind of like north, south, east, west. It's not that it's all ultimately just the master discourse.
Maybe to use some like Althuserian language here, and Althusser was the guy who met Lacan, who was the bridge to Marx, and you know, structure and dominance. For example, there's a combined and uneven presence of different structures. Now using Trotsky language, whatever, it sounds right? Combined and uneven development.
Was not as Trotsky as you know.
Well, yeah, but he used
to be fair to
took
these things,
the combined
as well as Heidegger, to go back to that.
It took uneven development from Trotsky, and I think that combined development is also important because right.
But anyway, who's counting?
I'm sorry, but yeah, and basically all four structures are present in a certain combined way, but it's the point about which structure is dominating this topological or logical dynamic is that matter. And definitely it's not classical logic, because classical logic does not have antagonism between lack and excess and between object A, which is radically outside of symbolizable structure. So that lack, that problem with logical classical logic is resolved within structuralism. No need for post-structuralism.
I'm just going to mention one thing. Perhaps this Lacan 1 and 2 might be better thought of as, in the beginning, it's an ontology that's linguistic based. It's an ontology of language. Then it becomes a mathematical ontology in the 70s. There's a real shift to the mathematics, and real attempt to formalize the unconscious, which was really the scientific project ultimately, in order to go back to Freud's 1895 project for a scientific psychology, which Lacan used to say, I'm not a Lacanian, I'm a Freudian. This is what he... Yeah, please. Yes, okay. Yeah, please.
And ultimately, it's absolutely true, first linguistic, then an ontology, through mathematics, and ultimately, Jacques kind of tried to map that. The very last Lacan is an ontic, so meaning that we are onto singular things. We have a history, a body, and that's how is that he tried pretty much to give to this subject that was ontological, linguistically based, mathematically based, nothing that lives. A being is only in language, as said Andrew, and then he tried to give a body to this abstract, logical subject. And what happens when you give a body? to this abstract structure.
I just wanted to say what you said. It's not to be understood as he develops any kind of meta language. I mean, for him, the mathematics are themselves language, and the problems that language deals with, exactly mathematics deal with. And in terms of in mathematics, they cannot be, for example, a set that includes all sets in itself because it never can include itself. And this Russell's paradox and Frege's formulation of it is exactly what Lacan uses to create these four discourses, but exactly by inscribing the lack of the symbolic within the logical totalizing structure, he's able to give new life to structuralism.
Are there any questions?
I'm hearing a lot of the paradigmatic. All of this is in a kind of symbolic mode, and when you say that we're moving towards this mathematic, which is the same as our language that we have now, the language of desire is a natural language, like English or French, and mathematics is an artificial language, like logic. I'd like to see the meaning-making of language, the parole rather than the Lacan. And I'd like to see it syntagmatic. What happens in time as you struggle to make meaning, one word after another?
In the later Lacan, it's a matter of cutting meaning, in a way. Like even in the analyst is because precisely if you keep it stay in the logic of meaning making, then you're gonna sort of remain entrapped in the dimension of.
We never get to a final meaning.
Right. So that's why, even for example, he says, well, in the Lacanian sort of psychoanalytic practice of analysis, there's a moment at the end called the pass. And the pass marks the end of your analysis, and the end of the analysis is sort of the last story that you tell to yourself about the real. Because he says that, in a way, the way we create meanings and we frame some narratives about ourselves is precisely what prevents us to get in touch with what is outside of speech. So speech is this sort of the only tool we have to grasp this reality, but at the same time, it's exactly what prevents us from getting in touch to it.
Yes.
So at some point, it's a matter of like, he's called it the blah 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 to cut it out.
No, that cuts out
Hence
creativity.
the fascination
Right, it's
of
not-
James Joyce,
I think it's-
especially the Joyce of Finnegan's Wakes.
Right.
Not
So
much
what
as
is-
So this
Ulysses
Lacanian
of the
anti-humanism exactly attacks the idea of language being a natural event. It perceives language as being operated by the function of language to complete itself, which is nothing natural except for kind of supposed self-preservation need of language.
No,
of being
natural
kind of-
language, I mean by what linguists distinguish are mathematics and logic and music notation, artificial languages, whereas natural language is French, Portuguese, Latin, whatever. Well, Latin is now no longer growing, so we call it dead. That's why it's in natural language.
Well, yeah, he problematizes the kind of like goes with post-structuralism along post-structuralism and questioning the naturalness of this language, and basically claims that any language is artificial, and therefore, and this is his main attack on humanism, that you cannot have some kind of narrative that will show our way forward. That in a way, pass, as Fred said, it is not some kind of final narrative that a subject walks out of the analyst's office with, but exactly the tool that we're trying to transfer to you today of cutting meaning into opening that we can then show as the structure behind the meaning, how meaning is being created, so that we can traverse the fantasy, exit maybe that interpolation in bourgeois society, and be able to think about something beyond the capitalist society.
To in effect take responsibility for our desire, to the power of our objectality, including if it's radical and revolutionary, instead of the busyness of university discourse and all the variations we might want to, in a historical materialist sense, want to just list out in some giant book on the quote Anthropocene, when it's quite simple that carbon emissions need to be reduced.
And maybe.
Yes. Oh, yeah, let's go on. We just have a few minutes.
I want to bring up one other thing that complicates this a little bit, and that's when Lacan's interested in topology, not just mathematics, but topology, in a way that supports somewhat the post-structuralist tendency for reading, because, and also in Jacques Lacan's discussions of extimacy, there's a problematization of surface and underneath, inside and outside. And Lacan did that very explicitly with the interior 8 and the Mobius strip and topological models. And that's, it's an interesting other aspect to add to the late Lacan that I think in some ways supports.
Absolutely, and because also going to the same previous question, I think because there's something called, and it's also the debate, is Derrida, I think, that you're raising.
That's what I had in mind.
Absolutely, and it's the question of the theory of a double writing. And how can we voice what cannot be included in speech, nonetheless in speech? And of course, Derrida is going to come to a double theory of writing in the form of joy too. And then what Lacan will develop would be a theory of topological writing of the Borromean knot that he says is a support to thinking. But a support to thinking that is detached from every utterance of speech, because it has nothing to do with utterances or the way we understand language. So it's a support as a drawing, but it has nothing to do with the writing or speech.
So Lacan is a materialist, so everything, all this is material, all these discourses are actual dynamics. And in this sense, he's already developed his topology early before for discourses. And so for discourses in themselves can be perceived as different topologies. For example, to simplify, sphere, Mobius strip, and torus, and a cross cap. And I can, if you have more questions about that, I can expand on that. But definitely, they are exactly shaped by language, and topology is nothing but language, and therefore there is no new transcendental stage in Lacan's theory when he exits the primacy of language in formation of theory. So in that regard, he completely states his fidelity to four discourses and the other side of psychoanalysis and this political application of them. And there is no meta-language. That's very...
No, but, topology isn't a meta-language. It's about non-orientability, the way that he reads it.
So are the discourses are also non-orientable.
Yeah, I agree.
Yeah.
I'm just saying it's another, for me, it enriches the four discourses to read it through the topological.
I mean, it is topological.
Yeah.
These four discourses are topological. They are in no direct relation to each other.
Question for you. Why is it hard for you to accept the fifth discourse? And why do you have to consider it a fifth when it is almost exactly the same as the analyst one?
That's incorrect.
Yeah.
It has the form of the analyst discourse,
No, it
but
does
then
not.
the status
What is the
of this one
distinction?
is
It does not. It pretends to be an analyst discourse. The capitalism pretends to know
Right.
what we desire, but really, as I said, the discourse that pretends to know what you want is university discourse. So in a way, university pretends to be analyst, pretends to be radical. It has fake radicals in it, and these fake radicals are pretending that they're moving from the position of their revolutionary desire or something, but in reality are exactly reaffirming the bourgeois ideology. So in this regard, we don't have fifth discourse because, as you said, it flips, but not in the analyst discourse. It flips
that one
into...
that you just crossed out looks exactly the same as the top right one.
Absolutely. Yeah, exactly. And that's why it's called capitalist discourse, because this discourse is a discourse of truth. It's the discourse of scientific theory that is based on logic and rationality. And therefore, it is not the same as the discourse based on knowledge, which is a discourse of, but this is the capitalist discourse.
No, that's not universalist.
Well,
Now we're getting
discourse is
confused.
a relationship of these three discourses. These three discourses, the university, the hysteric, and S1 are all driven by the symbolic. In this case here, S1 is here. In this case, S1 very much determines what knowledge is produced. In this case, of course, it's in power. The only discourse that is not a semblance is analyst discourse that radically questions the symbolic by coming from radical antagonism within
What
symbolic.
would you call this one on the fifth one? What would that be?
This is not even the right way that one
That's not even the right way.
Yeah, I'm sorry.
Because I drew it.
Okay, I'll throw it over here then, like this is.
Now we're becoming Lacanian.
It's just that
way that-
they're all the same, all right?
Yeah.
But the status of knowledge and the status of the S1 is the master signifier, and S2's knowledge has changed. That's what happened. They don't accept that there's a later Lacan. But they said that the capitalist discourse is a certain coming together of the university discourse
Okay.
and the master discourse.
Okay.
Okay? When sort of the S1 of the master discourse, which was supposed to be, this is my truth, and then you're going to back up my truth with some sort of science so that everyone's going to accept it, then the master discourse in a capitalist society is great, let's kill the master. And then, so the knowledge that is produced is that let's deconstruct the theory of the master. So
But
then,
that's hysterics discourse.
So then, what I'm saying is that then the status of knowledge and the status of the S1 changed.
Into university discourse.
In this instance, that's why you have
This
to
is
say-
analyst discourse.
Yeah, this is
It's
the
not
analyst
university
discourse, but then the value given to each symbol has shifted from the four discourses to the formulation or capitalist discourse.
Let's keep in mind historically too, when he's giving the seminar, that the University of Paris, where you went, was broken up.
Correct.
Right, that's another thing. The
Absolutely.
university discourse
Right.
became completely decentered,
Right.
right?
Lacan
Because
says, Lacan says we always speak in university discourse. That when we produce certain, right now that we're
Yes, of course.
transferring knowledge to, we are talking from university discourse. So in this regard, parole is university discourse as such, but it is capitalist discourse of kind of domination over the surplus production and surplus value. And again, the problem with the fifth discourse, it's really, he talks about this in one paragraph, then he comes back to it briefly later. This is, in the 71, year 71, the Milan lecture, actually, he brings this capitalist discourse to then make fun of people, if you read the whole thing, that who think that there is some kind of new discourse, that he says there is no 36 but 4 discourses at the end. So in this regard, it's being used, I think, by post-structuralists to kind of subvert the analytic discourse and to show how everything is relative and all knowledge and truth are kind of knowledge at the end of the day, and all knowledge is relative to each other. But really, this subversion is not really working if you see the ethical logic of 4 discourses that we described today.
Again, the thing is that you have to look at it as the agent to other product, the truth. So in the 4 discourses, always moves this way.
Mhm.
This is the key operation. When he drew it himself, he talks about how it's a kind of weird twist here, where we have the hysteric, it's like the hysteric, and it's moving down into what is technically always repressed this way, which is usually in all the proper 4 discourses, so to speak, moving this way.
It's not even connecting with others. It's not even forming social
So
relations.
it's not even connecting, exactly. So it's not even creating a symbolic order, so to speak, where there's an ethical responsibility between the most minimum of 2 people, or 1, 2, and other, which is, in a certain sense, Lacan's concept of the individual is always social. So even when we're alone, we're still with others. So, okay, so when, in a normal discourse, so to speak, normal is pretty word, but in the 4 discourses, there's a dynamic relationship from agent to other. This is cut here in a very strange way, the capitalist discourse. It really needs further investigation to figure out. In some regards, we talk about it as perverse discourse. As a kind of, that's why the words fake discourse makes sense. It's a kind of a fake out, looks hysteric, but then manipulates in a kind of strange way. Doesn't create a proper symbolic bond between the two, the agent and another.
Okay, one more question, and then we're going to have to break, because I know people want to get coffee before then other Hegelian triads. Yeah, please.
Andrew, yeah.
I'd like to return to what my friend asked about computers.
Yeah.
Speak up. Sorry. Asking a question about the statement about computers and how I believe you said that until a computer has a body and learns language, it cannot think.
Yeah.
Does it still work in the sense that a lot of computer programs come preloaded with language systems, such as Siri, which already comes loaded with basically a language package that it can intuit around? And
Well, I mean, we can get into sort of a deconstruction of words and what we mean by thought, but what I'm trying to focus on is that thought, as far as us humans are concerned, is to some extent connected to the concept of the symptom. So we think because of something that hurts. That is to say, we are attempting to deal with a conflict that has arisen at some point. There's a certain gap that has arisen. And language is the best case, or language in the broad sense, including logic, including math, etc., is what we've got to attempt to figure out what just happened, trauma, pain, etc. So without those events, so to speak, of trauma, I don't think a thing can think, so to speak.
But it's an answer to more of the argument.
Yeah, so what? Yeah.
Could a computer ever go through the mirror stage?
It doesn't seem so.
Doesn't seem so.
Yeah.
Alan Harriet.
It cannot get alienated towards itself. It's not, it's, you know, I think that it can have a kind of void in the big other, in the language, and its code, but it cannot have a void between some nonsensical that only body can have. That nonsensicality of objecta, that nonsensical nature of something that's left over is not there. But there is a void in the symbolic itself, and that's exactly how language works with our body, because both our body has a void and a scar from language, and language itself is incomplete. And that's the materiality of language that allows us, incompleteness of language, incompleteness of body allows us to use it.
It's a theory of the political body, not a theory of a natural real.
That's good. Good way. So next year, I propose you come back and we'll do the imaginary, right? For the left, right? Thank you very much.